When we talked about the affinity rule concepts in the previous nugget, unfortunately, that's not quite enough to have it work. To make it work, we have to create the rules and apply them to the cluster. So here's our game plan for this hands-on lab. We want to have an affinity rule where VM1 and VM2 are going to run on the same exact host. And we don't care what host that is. It could be ES6A1, 2, or 3. If we set up the rule that just says they have to run together, we'll let the cluster decide which host to put them on. Secondly, let's create an anti-affinity rule for VMs 3 and 4, so they have to run on different ESXi hosts. And third, let's create an affinity rule that says that VM2 must run on ESXi2. And to do the VM to host relationship, we do have to make groups. So we're going to have to make a group of VMs. In this case, it'll just be one VM in the group. It'll be VM2. And we'll make a host group. It'll be one host, ESXi2. And then we'll set the affinity rule. And if any of our rules are in conflict with each other, the initial rule sticks and the new rule that has a conflict is disabled. So here in the vSphere web client, let's go ahead with the Hosts and Clusters tab selected. Let's go ahead and click on Cluster 1. It's taking us to the VMs tab because that's where we left it. And while we're here, let's go ahead and highlight VM1, hold the Shift key down, click on VM4, so they're all selected, and let's go ahead and start all of those VMs. And because DRS at the cluster level is set to fully automated mode, it'll put those VMs nice and evenly, or fairly evenly, across the host in the cluster. We can also see over here the host assignment. So we have a couple on ESXi2 and a couple on ESXi3, and then the vCenter server appliance itself is running as a VM on ESXi1. And with the cluster selected, if we click on the Summary tab, it has a nice overview of the resources currently in use, and if we expand the vSphere DRS right here, it'll give us a nice visual representation regarding the current balance. It's also showing us here that the DRS is set to fully automated. Alright, so let's create some affinity rules. To do that, we'll right-click on the cluster, and from the drop-down, we can click on Settings, or since we're already at the cluster, we can just click on Configure. Either way will get us there. And if we want to create affinity rules, what we'd do in this column right here is we go down under Configuration, and we would click on VM/host rules. This is where we're going to go to start the creation and application of our affinity rules. So let's click on VM/host rules. There's no rules currently in place. If there were, they would show up down here. So we'll click on Add to add a new rule. So we'll click on Add, and the first rule that we want to add is an affinity rule for VM1 and VM2 to hang out on the same ESXi host. So let's name this VM1 and VM2 together. We'll go ahead and have a check in the checkbox to enable this rule. For the type, we'll specify that we want to keep virtual machines together, and then we'll click on Add to identify VM1 and VM2. So we'll put a check next to VM1, a check next to VM2. Now, before we click on OK, currently these are on different ESXi hosts. These two VMs are. And because they're currently running and we have DRS in fully automated mode, it's going to move one of those VMs over to the other ESXi host so they can be together. So we'll click on OK, and then click on OK. So here's our rule. The listed two virtual machines must run on the same host. And if we clicked on the VMs tab here, and let's do a refresh to make sure everything's updated, you'll notice that VM1 and VM2 now are on the same ESXi host. They're both on ESXi2. So the affinity rule was implemented. That's great. Let's go ahead and let's make another rule to keep VM3 and 4 apart. Now currently, VM3 and VM4 right here are both on ESXi3. And when you do this lab, when you do the hands-on practice, it could be that the DRS automatically put these VMs on different ESXi hosts. But the key is that once we have the affinity rules in place, we can go and verify that regardless of where the VMs were originally, we can verify that the affinity rules have been applied. So in this case, VM1 and VM2 running on the same host, and what we're about to do is VM3 and VM4 being on different hosts. So with the cluster still selected, we'll click on the Configure tab once again, and under Configuration on VM/host rules, we'll click on Add, and this time we'll add an anti-affinity rule. And let's name this VM3 and VM4 apart. We'll enable the rule, and for the type, we're going to go ahead and specify that we want to separate those virtual machines so that they're not running on the same ESXi host. Maybe those two VMs just take a lot of resources, we already know it, and we just simply want to make sure they never get run on the same exact host. And then we'll click on Add to identify from the list that VM3 and VM4 are going to be included in this rule. So with VM3 and VM4 identified, we'll click on OK. And then we'll click on OK again, and it's implemented. So if we go back to the VMs tab, so here we have VM3 and VM4. Now, it's currently showing that ESXi3 is the host for both of them. What we might want to do is give it just a moment and then click on refresh here in the vSphere web client. And it looks like it's still on the same host. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to click down on recent tasks. Oh, good. There we go. So it's not done yet. It's in the process of migrating some virtual machines. So it just moved VM1 and VM2 around. Let's go ahead and minimize recent tasks. Let me click on refresh. And look at that. That's fantastic. So because we had the rule about VM1 and VM2, it migrated both of them over to a different ESXi host. And then regarding VM3 and VM4, it separated them. Put one on ESXi2 and another one on ESXi3. And the reason it's avoiding working with ESXi1 is because the vCenter server appliance, which is consuming a lot of memory on ESXi1, has his hands pretty full. And if ESXi1 didn't have that memory consumed and didn't have the vCenter server appliance running on it, it would very likely be put in this mix regarding the ESXi host being selected by DRS. Now, for our last rule, which is going to cause a change again, we want to have VM2 run on ESXi2, and currently it's running on ESXi3. And again, when you run this lab, it really doesn't matter initially what host the VM is running on. The goal is, after you implement the affinity rule, we want to make sure that those rules are being followed. So to have a VM run on a specific host, we have to have a group of VMs, and we have to have a group of hosts. In our case, it's just going to be one VM in this group and one host in that group. And then we can specify that this VM group must run on this host group as part of our rule. We can also say it should run on that group, but if we want to enforce the rule no matter what, we're going to use the must option instead. So with the cluster selected, we'll click on the configure tab, and we need to create our group. So under configuration, we're going to click on VM/host groups, and we're going to create two groups, a VM group and a host group. So we'll click on add. We'll call this VMs. From the drop down, we'll specify that this is a VM group, and we're just going to add one VM to this group. And that's going to be VM2 based on our plan, and we'll click OK. We'll click OK again, and then we'll add one more group. So we'll click on add. This time it's going to be a host group, and we'll call this our host group. We'll click on add. Here's going to be a list of our ESXi hosts. We're going to choose ESXi2 to be the single member of that group and click OK, and OK again. So there's our VM group and our host group, and now what we'll do is we'll go back under configuration down to VM/host rules, and we'll simply set up an affinity rule between the host group and the VM group. So to do that, we'll click on add once again to create a new rule. And let's name this VM2 runs on ESXi2. And then from the type, because they're not both VMs, we'll use the drop down. We can choose the option for virtual machines to hosts. Now the option below that, the virtual machines to virtual machines, if we had two groups of virtual machines that we wanted to say they need to run together, or we want to run them apart, that's also an option here using the group option. But for our case, it's virtual machine groups to host groups, so we'll select that. And now it's asking us for the groups involved. So from the drop down, we only have one VM group, we'll select it. From our host group, we only have one, so we'll select it. And then the option regarding the affinity rule is what do you want to have happen. And we're going to choose the option of must run on host in group. So the must says it has to happen. Should, it says, yeah, if it's possible, make it happen. In our example here, we want it absolutely to happen. So we're going to click on must run on host in group. Click on OK. So here's our new rule right there. If we click on it, it'll show us the details of it down below. And if we created a conflicting rule, and let's just do that so you can see it, we'll click on add. And currently we have a rule that VM1 and VM2 should run on the same host. If we created a rule, VM1 and VM2, on different hosts, which is in conflict with our initial rule, it said VM1 and VM2 have to be together, and from the drop-down regarding type, we said this is an anti-affinity rule, separating the virtual machines. Clicking on add and adding VM1 and VM2, it's not going to let us effectively have this rule enforced. So if we click on OK, we get a nasty gram saying, wah, 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 it's in conflict, it's going to be disabled. And we'll click OK. So the rule still exists right here. It has a little icon representation that there's a conflict. So the conflict is with VM1 and VM2 together. The original rule is enabled. It's in place. The new rule that just got added is not enabled. And so we'd have to go ahead and resolve that by not having a conflicting rule if we wanted all the rules enabled. So I'm going to select the VM1 and VM2 on different hosts. I'm going to delete that rule. Click on yes. Let it refresh. And now we're not in conflict. So let's go verify that VM2 really is running on ESXi2. We can do that by clicking on VMs, And here we have VM2, and indeed it is running on ESXi2. And if we click on recent tasks, we can see all the work it's been doing in the background. Now, one other thing that we could do is we could set up an affinity rule for this VM vCenter server appliance, because I like in the lab to have it always running on ESXi1 so I know exactly where it is. So what we could do is set up an additional rule just to keep that vCenter server appliance on ESXi1. So to do that, we'd follow the same process we did where we told VM2 to run on ESXi2. We would create a VM group and a host group and set up affinity between those groups. I'd also like to take this opportunity to explain why we don't actually have to set up a separate rule for that vCenter server appliance. If we click on that vCenter server appliance here in the inventory, and we click on the summary tab. So here, if we look at the related objects regarding the vCenter server appliance, it's currently running on ESXi1, and here's the reason that this VM won't vMotion over to another ESXi host. And that's because that VM is currently using the local data store on ESXi1. So the reason that vMotion won't work in this case is that ESXi2 and ESXi3, the other host in the cluster, they don't have direct access here to the local data store on ESXi1. So for that reason alone, we don't have to worry about DRS vMotioning the vCenter server appliance off of ESXi1. However, just for sound practices, I would like to set up an affinity rule that makes sure that even if we do move the data store to shared network storage, that each of the ESXi hosts have access to, that the VM is not going to be moved. So let's go back to the cluster. So here in the navigator, with the Host and Clusters tab selected, we'll click on Cluster 1. With the cluster selected, we'll click on the Configure tab. And let's click on the VM/host groups, because we're going to need to make groups for the VM and the host. So we'll click on Add. And I'm going to name this VCSA, so we know what it is. And it's going to be a VM group. We'll click on Add. We'll specify our vCenter server appliance VM. Click OK as the single member of that group, and click OK. Then we'll click Add once more to create a group for ESXi1. So we'll specify a host group. We'll specify this is ESXi-1. Click on Add to specify that we want the ESXi1 host as the member of that group, and then click OK. Then we'll click OK again, and now that we have those groups, one for the vCenter server appliance and one for the ESXi host, we'll then go back to VM/host rules right here, and we'll click on Add. And we'll name this the vCenter server appliance must run on ESXi1. From the drop down for the type, we'll specify that we're going to link VMs to hosts. And then the group is going to be the VCSA group for VMs, and the host group is going to be the ESXi group. And then from the requirement, we're going to not specify should, we're going to say must. That this VM group must run on this host group, and we'll click OK. And since that VM is already running on that host, there's nothing to worry about as far as a migration right now. So if we go back to VMs and just verify the vCenter server appliance indeed is running on ESXi1, and besides the VM using the local data store on ESXi1, we now also have an affinity rule which is going to park that VM exclusively on that ESXi host. So my friend, now it is your turn to have some practice in creating, implementing, and verifying the affinity rules in a vSphere environment. So have some fun in the hands-on lab, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.